Hello everyone, welcome to CPPR Dialogue on Insights into Change, Recent Trends in India's Female Labour Force Participation. I am Anu Maria Francis, Senior Associate Research and Project Management at the Center for Public Policy Research, Kochi, and the host for your day. Today, we will be discussing the trends in the female labour force participation rate in India in the past decade or so. And for giving us insights on this topic, we have with us Ms. Yamini Atmavilas, President of Strategy, Data and Applied Research at Udaidi Foundation. So before getting started, the most pertinent question, why we are discussing this. Today, being International Women's Day, it is an ideal time to discuss women's representation in the Indian labor market and how the country has performed in terms of the female labor force participation rates in the past decade. For the general information of the audience, the labor force participation rate is actually defined as the percentage of persons in the labor force. And it includes those who are working, those who are seeking work, as well as who are available for work in the population. So now coming to the topic at hand. To give a context, before 2017-18, the quinquennial employment-unemployment surveys, the EUS surveys, were used to measure the employment situation in the country. But later in 2017-18, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation started the annual series of surveys called the Periodic Labour Force Survey, which is the PLFS survey, which provides a status of labour force participation rates as of now. The data from periodic labour force surveys since 2017-18 actually provides us a glimmer of hope when it comes to the female labour force participation rates. If you look at the usual status for those category that is above 15 years of age, we can see an increase from 23.3% in 2017-18 to 37% in 2020-23 reports. So there is an increasing trend in the FLPR. But at the same time, India was ranked 127 out of 146 countries in terms of gender parity, according to the annual gender gap report released by World Economic Forum. So the index actually, one of the indicators, one of the parameters used in the index, the Global Gender Gap Report, is economic participation and opportunities. And India's poor performance in this particular parameter for women is actually contributing to the country's persistently low ranking in this particular index. A large part of this economic participation and opportunities parameter actually relates to women's participation in the labor force. So again, if you look at the World Bank data, in 2022, the female labor force participation rates are about 28%, which is very different from the PLFS survey. So in this context, I feel it's very necessary to understand, we need to have a discussion, we need to have an understanding as to how we calculate the female labor force participation rates in the PLFS surveys. What is the concept of labor force? Who are the people included in the workforce? So for the understanding of this, we have with us our guest, Ms. Yamini. She is a gender sector expert and leader with a track record of building impactful partnerships for advancing gender justice. She believes that gender data is critical to changing a world designed for men and has many flagship initiatives that leverage data and systems thinking to solve women's economic empowerment issues. As president of the Udaidi Foundation, she conceptualized and leads an initiative focused on closing the gender gap in employment. For nearly a decade, she led portfolios on women's economic empowerment programs with women collectives, evidence to policy initiatives on women labor force participation, and health systems research and evaluations with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she founded an ambitious portfolio of scalable programs for women's collectives, rural livelihoods, social empowerment, and evidence and think tank initiatives. Yamini has also led the gender studies area at the Administrative Staff College, Hyderabad, providing policy research and advisory and capacity on gender policies, gender budgeting and gender data, and monitoring and evaluation initiatives across South Asia. She is widely published on gender, employment, health, education, and economic development. She has also been a fellow at OECD Development Center's Poverty Reduction and Social Development Division, and also holds a PhD in Women's Studies from Emory University. So thanks, Yamini, for joining us, and welcome to CPPR Dialogue.
Thank you, Anu. Thank you for having me.
So coming to our conversation, so as I mentioned already in the context, the nationwide EUS survey, which is the Employment and Unemployment Survey, has been replaced by the PLFS survey from 2017-18. So what are the major changes in the methodology or the sampling framework when we compare the two surveys, and what are the effects of the changes?
Thanks, Anu. I mean, we have lived with the PLFS for almost 5 years now, right? I think the change happened 2017 onwards, and then 2018-19 was the first round. The good thing, I'll first talk about many of the positive things that PLFS has introduced into the ecosystem, which is one, we have far more frequent understandings and insights into what's happening with labor markets. And definitely post-COVID, labor markets have been very, very dynamic, and we have needed to understand what is going on. We may not necessarily always get a complete picture from just a survey alone, and need to stitch a larger picture together, looking at industry, labor bureau, also what's happening in sector and from business data. But I think overall what the PLFS does is give us more and more frequent data on what is going on and what are people's aspirations, as well as just dynamic nature of how job seeking, how people go in and out of the labor force even, or in and out of employment status. So I think the PLFS is far more sensitive as an instrument, number one. Number two, the sampling strategy, in terms of periodicity, the EUS was once every 5 years, right? So compared to that, a quarterly survey like this, while even, 4 rounds in a particular year may not make a big time series trend, but I think over 4-5 years, we have quite rich data thanks to PLFS, number one. Number two, in terms of what it tries to measure, I think this is really significant, which is it looks at employment in terms of two parameters, right? Like one is the usual status, and the second is the CWS, or the current weekly status. Most surveys stop with CWS. Most surveys stop with, did you work in this week, in the past 1 week? Did you work today, yesterday? And how many days did you either work or try to access some kind of work opportunity? Whereas what the PLFS does is do this over also in the past 1 year. Now, there are some recall issues that some experts have pointed out, but I still feel, and many experts feel, that 1 year is still not such a long gap, right? Like if you're thinking about last 5 years, there would be a gap in your memory. But in the last 1 year, have you tried to either seek work or access some kind of a work opportunity? I think it is a reasonable sort of a question to ask. And so I think what this has done is give us a better understanding of how are people actually accessing labor markets and what's happening. Are they getting turned away? Have they tried to get work, and so on? So I think that these are two big things. The third sort of change, and there are many others, but the third sort of significant changes, I think in the urban sample, there have been some sampling differences, especially for half the sample. In the rural sample, there's, I think, 3 or 4 return sort of visits happen to the same household, whereas in urban, there is a rotational sort of an approach. And then eventually some households fall out. So I think some of these have created issues of comparability with the older surveys. And those remain. I think we are getting a better understanding of unemployment, I feel, compared to, older estimates that used to remain around 2%, right? Whereas now we have a better, more calibrated understanding. At the same time, we also have a better understanding of women's work. So I think as we have this conversation more today, there have been continuous sort of improvements in how PLFS is trying to understand both male and female and younger people's work. And we also have this very other beautiful survey of the time use survey, right? Which is also helping us triangulate, how are people spending time? Because how people are spending time is a nice validation of what is it that they're doing in terms of paid work versus unpaid work. So I think the picture is changing, but it's not for the worse. I think we have more and more insights. At the same time, I think a lot of, we have a lot of data. And so for people who are interested in this research, I think there's plenty to do. Back to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that pointed differences, giving this pointed differences. And as you said, time use survey is definitely a great source to study along with PLFS survey. Coming to my second query, one is so when you talk about women workforce distribution, it has actually improved over the years as
Yeah.
per the PLFS survey. As I said, it was 23% in 2017-18, but now we can see it is about 37%. So there is
Yeah.
a like more than 10% increase over the last 5 years. That's what we can see. So can we actually attribute these to the policy efforts from the different stakeholders or the governmental initiatives? Or is it because of the changes in the sampling technique or the way it is calculated? So
Sure. So, I mean, it's a great question. And I think the answer is either or both, right? In a typical economics way. So, I'll first start with saying number one, COVID has been a major glitch in that, in the pattern itself. And so now, post COVID patterns is where we are trying to understand things better and better. So, number one, the increase you have noted to me comes from two places. One, there is a palpable increase in women's work participation in rural India, especially. And when you disaggregate the data, this is the finding that over the last couple of years we've been seeing. Now, we should not be sorry. So that's one. Second is who are these workers and what is the kind of work you're seeing, right? And the work is very, very heavily about agriculture, and it's very heavily around unorganized or non-contract, manual, drudgerous kind of work. So very traditional sort of sector is where you're seeing an increase, number one. And there are, again, experts have written about the fact that this is perhaps linked to rural distress due to post-COVID fallen income, COVID and post-COVID fallen incomes, due to indebtedness. Even the uptake of NREGA has increased over the years, and a lot of the COVID-related benefits, pandemic-related benefits that the government put in place have had extremely high uptake. And so I think there is, number one, that fact we cannot deny, that there is rural distress, and women's work participation in rural areas increasing is in one sense linked to that distress. That, and this is a very typical coping pattern in how rural households and in the literature on women's work. That's number one. Number two, in the last few two rounds, what you, especially in the last one round, the increase one is seeing is also due to what you suggested, which is a change in measurement, right? Um, there is, for a long time, India has not adopted some of the international standards in measuring SNA, the National Accounting System. For example, if you were to prepare cow dung cakes and bring water from outside the household premises within the household, even though that can have economic benefits accruing to the household, it was not counted as a economic activity, and that was not counted as work. Whereas in this past round, some of these codes have been re-looked at and included in paid work. And so again, what you're seeing is some of the economic activities related to either homestead agriculture or reproduction of the homestead occupation, or economic activities that have productive value performed within the household. Several of them are now being counted. And in fact, historically, not counting them has been a miss on our part. And so I think this is a positive trend, but to your point, can we see it as a net increase in women's work participation? I think somewhere we'll have to sit down, and some of these, the tables are not available in the recent report either. So as more and more of that data is released and more of the explanatory variables and codes are released, we'll get a better picture. But my hunch is these are the two things happening. One, there is a net increase of low quality, low or non-remunerative agriculture related work that is traditionally rural women have participated in. And on the other hand, you are seeing some reclassification, which is a positive thing. But what is the share of one versus two is something that I think we need to really wait for the data so we can actually account for it. But I do think both of these are happening. They're not, one is a worrying trend, the other one is not, is a good thing that the policymaker is doing. Now, your main question, which is, can this be attributed to policy changes, right? Can this be attributed to anything in policy? I think we have to stitch that story together, right? For example, when you look at NREGA, you are seeing a bit of an increase, and women have always outperformed the share of NREGA uptake compared to men, and so that remains the story. Second is agriculture, as I said, I think that is the larger share of rural women's work, and therefore it is both a worrying trend as well as potentially not exactly a policy initiative that is being that's out there. On the third, I think we are seeing a lot of input variables where things have improved on the policy front, right? When you look at a policy analysis. So Mudra, the usual things that we looked at, the JAM Trinity, women's access to bank accounts, women's access to skilling, some of these things in younger workers, younger populations, especially, you're seeing women actually more in skilling classes than men. But does that convert into employment? We are not seeing that data very clearly. And so I think some of the input variables seem to suggest that there are some positive trends in the policy uptake. But whether that is actually converting into livelihoods and employment opportunities is still, I think we are not able to make that conclusion. However, I do think that labor markets are getting reconfigured, are getting and the biggest puzzle is the urban, Anu, because the urban scenario is where India is very, very, just needs to do a lot more work. And so you're also seeing some of the states announcing urban work guarantee programs in the urban areas. And a lot of that uptake, the majority of that uptake is by women. So then you are seeing that there is a latent, not just a latent, but an actual demand for this. And yet we are not able to create decent work opportunities in the urban context either. So that would be sort of my analysis. Back to you.
Okay. Yeah, so I was actually reading on this and I was getting this two sides to the story. So some were saying the policy initiatives are not actually giving that much of impact. It is just the measurements and the norm story which was uh, giving explanations to the increase in the PLFS. But again, there was another story which was saying the household enterprises have started becoming bigger because the self-employment part is contributing more towards the increase in the PLFS data. So that is on account of the household helpers for the family enterprises. So again, the reason which was stated is the increase in the mudra and the other allocations that is coming in. So I think we should believe both stories, as you said. To an extent, both have helped the PLFS data to improve. So coming back to the end note which you said, so historically the female labor force participation rates among urban women is quite low when you compare it with the rural women. So why is that a trend sustaining for long, and how we can improve this status?
I'll start with the second part first. I think the urban women's employment piece remains a bit of a mystery for two, or at least the puzzle can be explained in 2-3 ways. I don't think we have one silver bullet explanation for it, which is there are 3 or 4 things. One, the preponderance of informality in urban women's work, right? So they go in and out of the labor force. Informal work is measured poorly and captured poorly, and we need better and better ways of capturing it. So there is a measurement question and a question that is that your measurement has to be very calibrated to urban women's labor market behavior and urban women occupations, which are very different from rural. So that's number one, the preponderance of informality. The second is, I mean, the big thing that we are talking about, probably the second most in this country is the whole question of the care economy and care, right? In rural areas, there is still some kind of social safety net, social networks, because of the presence of kin groups and rural sort of village groups. You see some sort of support within the family or grandparents or somewhere, within the ecosystem, there is relations and so on that look after kids. In urban areas, this has now become a major, major crisis, right? And it's not just in the poorer populations. This is across the urban segments. In fact, one of the biggest dropouts is in the middle class segment. And so the absence of predictable, affordable, at scale sort of care solutions is one of the bigger challenges in the urban area. And you saw this during COVID. I mean, the great resignation in the highest paid ITES service sectors, through healthcare, through several sectors, you started to see in the formal economy that kind of drop, right? And then you had work from home, so things were starting to improve with flexibility. But now, as you see, return to work, return to 5-day work weeks, again we are sensing a crisis. And so this is one of the big issues. The second big issue that comes out in urban in some ways, both in defining women's access to work, is safety and access to transportation, the commute. And a lot of it comes down to both safety as well as time, right? Because I think we are seeing only the money as one of the resources, but the other biggest resource for women where there are huge constraints is time. So while Mudra, etc., provides credit, opportunities, bank accounts, savings, insurance, all of those things, that is taking on finance. But women's time remains one of the biggest areas where there is a crisis. And so the Time Use survey in India gives you that headline that women, Indian women perhaps are among the top numbers in terms of unpaid work contributions, number of hours they put in. Compared to men, it's 7 times more. Indian men do less household work than global counterparts. So I think there are a lot of this data, and that time use data, that's why it's a very, very critical resource for us. And you did see the change. Now, it's not that gender norms are permanent. So during COVID, post-COVID, you did see that in some households, men started to do more of this. So there are sort of these shocks to the system, even the household systems, where you sort of see redefinition of roles and men doing more on the childcare and on cooking and so on. So I think that is sort of where the solution side sort of starts to come in. But we cannot wait for some other, some trend to sort of create that shock to the system. That shock is to come within ourselves also. And so employers, policy, they all have a role to play in this. And I think urban is a place where we have to get more creative, but also more possibilities exist just because there is access, there is access to digital, access to services, you have a booming economy, so you're able to sort of create some of this infrastructure. So I think urban remains the one that we need to really solve for. The sort of small addition to this is urban inequality is also growing, right? Whether it in terms of health, in terms of incomes. So again, we saw COVID, we saw the condition of migrant workers and migrant populations in urban areas. All of that is is in a lot of flux right now. So unless we deal with this issue of migration, also at the same time that we're looking at employment, gender, livelihoods, income security, we will be missing a big part of that picture and the ability to solve for it. Back to you.
Yeah, I think that is very relevant when you talk of the state of Kerala, where I'm. So here we have most of the, I think half of the area, Kerala state is urbanized.
Yes.
We have more towns here. So, but again, the female labor force participation rates are very skewed when it comes to the urban female labor force participation rates. One of the things what I feel is, I think these childcare facilities, as you said, so these things, we need more innovative mechanisms to bring these women to the labor market by investing in childcare facilities and other affordable options for them to come to the labor market. So how do you think this urban employment guarantee schemes would help this?
I mean, it's a great question, and I think there's a couple of different ways of imagining it, right? What if you created a double duty kind of intervention? What if you said even provision of childcare, which we know actually also is something that women do. So it's a highly feminized occupation. And with that, I would add even things like elder care. I mean, you spoke about Kerala, so definitely elder care, health care, different newer sort of healthcare needs. A lot of this demand is met by women because of the traditional association of women with care, which is not necessarily it is a nurture and a social perception, but it is creating a labor market for and a demand for women's work, right? So I think number one, if we can recalibrate or look at the kind of things that are covered within the urban guarantee program, the kind of tasks right now in a couple of states, it's linked to, even in Kerala, it's linked to Ayankali and these programs. They're linked to particular PW, like public works, right? And it's about constructing a public building, or it's about roads and creating sort of public infrastructure. What if we could add even provision of public childcare to urban jobs, right? And then you create
Yes.
a double duty intervention where you are then employing women, getting them these localized kind of work opportunities, and that will then have the intervention where it will actually release other women to pursue either labor market opportunities or other kind of activities, right? So it creates a nice sort of systemic approach there. And so this is one, and I think the even the MWCD at the center has outside of the urban jobs framework, they have also launched a program called Palna, which is
Okay.
layering in creches onto the Anganwadi system. Now we know the Anganwadi system is overstretched, and it has been so right now it is an optional thing where Anganwadis can request resources. There is a budget for it, and what it does is give you the budget to extend the timings and perhaps pay for a creche worker and change your infra. So I think these are interesting policy moves that are sensitive to the care needs that women workers and communities have, and understand that within that design one needs a very trustworthy location. So an Anganwadi is a good place to plug it into. Second, it needs trustworthy people, right? And so therefore I think creating like in an urban jobs context, if we can create localized sort of systems, and Kerala has done this in so many programs and so well. And so creating localized community, sort of communitized solutions, leveraging some of these budgets, I think it's a really, I think this is the way that one can create a network of these solutions. Because otherwise waiting for some big program for creches, it's not tenable right now, right? It's
Yes.
very, very difficult. Where is the budget? Who will pay for it? What is the infrastructure that one needs to create? It's tough to do. The one exception is the state of Haryana, where they actually have launched a distinct creche program with its own so infrastructure, its own staffing. And but Haryana is also a highly urbanized and a small state. So it's, again, for large states and for where, you have women who need this service, I think one has to create a diverse set of solutions for it. Back to you.
So, Yamini, so one last question. So, in all these studies, it is we are marching towards a 5 trillion economy, right? So, in all the studies, it's very clear that we need more women in the labor market, and we are still in 30s in the numbers. So, to reach 50s, what should we do in a larger context?
Sure. Number one, reaching 50 is a good thing. I think we're on a good path. One, I would say a focus on the quality of work, not just the quantity. At the same time that we are looking at the numbers from shifting from 30s to 50, we have to look at creating quality work opportunities, because that will end up retaining women in the workforce. So what we have are two issues. One is you have to increase the net number of women in the labor force. And second is you have to retain the ones who have come in. And the way to keep them in is better wages, decent jobs, formal jobs. I think for me, formal jobs are the way to go, because then you have contracts, you have wages, you have conditions of work that are then formalized, and contract and systems that actually keep women in the workforce. So this is just a basic, I think, vanilla kind of a thing that, can we have semi-formal, formal sort of pathways? Number one. Second, I think this requires a policy push. No one, you cannot go one employer to another employer. And I think a lot of our focus on policy has been on, when it comes to women, has been on the supply side. We invest in skilling, we invest in norms, we invest in parental education, we invest in schooling. So we are going on preparing women for the labor market. But are we doing anything to open up labor markets for women? Right. And so my personal view is that, and I joined some of the experts again who have been working on this quite a bit, is we have to work with employers. We have to work with employers and to actually create greater opportunities and include women. So in fact, one of the programs, post-COVID, the PLI scheme, the productivity linked incentive scheme, was a good sort of approach to keep businesses open, to keep MSMEs open so that they would actually function and have greater productivity. So then to boost productivity and GDP, we sort of had a program, a scheme like that. And that continues. Now, can we have an employment linked incentive program? Can we have a women's employment linked incentive program that keeps employers, that makes the employers in some ways as the target for both incentives, and much of it should be carrots, right? We should not be thinking about sticks at this point in time. So I think if we want to really move the numbers of women in the labor market, it's not just about preparing women for, future of work, AI. I mean, there's a lot of interesting new challenges that the economy is throwing on us. And I think there are initiatives to get women more skilled for this, but skilling is insufficient. So one, I think the apprenticeship program, the NAP scheme, is a interesting one, where at least there is a part subsidy going to employers who have male and female apprentices, and a slightly greater number for women. Similarly, I think taking a similar approach like that, like some states provide wage subsidies. So the textile, for example, or electronics, can we have a slightly additional wage subsidy for companies or firms that have at least 30% women or 40% women? I think we have to really think through what are the barriers, and then what exactly do we open up with them? What is the right incentivization that has to happen? The MSME is the engine of growth. I think large enterprises, large corporates are already making a lot of efforts. I think the MSMEs have a lot of pain points because the margins are low. I think they often say maternity leave of 6 months is a big barrier to even employment. So it's turning into a discouragement or a disincentive. I think this is an area that needs urgent attention. I do think that one has to create positive incentives and supports, right? We need policy and we need government to come in to support. Otherwise, it's creating a perverse impact. So I think employer incentives, and there are a lot of good examples in other countries that need to be looked at the same time. I think we have to get the hygiene right within the firms, right? We've often talked about saying, let's not just have maternity leave, let's have parental leave. Because then when men also go, then there is an equalization, equilibrium that one reaches, as opposed to always sort of seeing it as a women's problem. So like that, if there are support and subsidies that are channeled to employers, to provide some of these support systems, at the same time, one is also getting the employers up to a certain level of standards or understanding of some of these, what could be some of the better practices. I think this is the two-pronged approach that I think would help. But I mean, just one last sentence on this is, we absolutely need a big sort of boost. So my hunch is that services and digitally enabled jobs, these are two very, very big opportunities where work opportunities can be created. Manufacturing is important. And I think you're seeing some of the tailwinds that are getting companies into India, like the phone manufacturing, semiconductor industry is sort of booming. And you're seeing a lot of states that are investing in incentivizing companies to sort of set up there. But for rural women, right, where you have masses of rural women who are out of the workforce or in very, very poor quality work, the at-scale solution has to come from services, right, because of the skill barrier. So I think we really have to look at services and digital work in some ways and see how we can crack the rural market for this. Back to you.
Thanks, Yamini. I think many of these points are very relevant because, as you said, when you think of different states, we can't go for a one size fits all approach, right? So I think the demand side and the supply side has to be studied properly. So in some states we need more supply side solutions, but in some states we need more demand side solutions. So yeah, thanks for all the insights. So, as we come to an end to the conversation, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to you for joining us. So, and for giving us a dynamic landscape of all the female labor force participation rates in the country and how it has impacted the women jobs. So, as we move forward, let's harness the insights to drive meaningful change. And let's continue to work together towards the more inclusive and equitable future for all, irrespective of gender. So I would like to thank our organizing team at CPPR for organizing this dialogue. For this, I would like to formally close the proceedings and thank you once again.